You've got questions, we've got answers.
And I think that makes your pathway to university a lot easier.
The brain,
especially the first year if you pick the right subjects in year 11 and 12.
Information.
Here, and those signals run down through the spine.
Here in our studio, we'll be bringing you the answer to these questions and more. Join us for InfoMate. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of InfoMate. On today's program, we'll be focusing on the affordability of property and how that's affected the family dynamic over time, and learn a bit more about the history of how property ownership and property values have changed over time. And to help us discuss those topics, we have the pleasure here to be joined by Professor Garrick Small. Again, thank you very much, Professor, for joining us on today's program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we want to talk about affordability in today's program. So when we talk about affordability of property, what are we talking about in general here?
The general perception in the community is that it's harder to own a house now. To actually measure that is a little bit complicated, and so we're now using arbitrary measures that are measurable. Okay. And so we would say if somebody is spending more than 30% of their income on housing, then their housing is unaffordable because it's taking too much out of the rest of their pay packet, and so they can't buy clothes, food, and the other things that people need. And this measure of affordability, while it's fairly arbitrary, has at least given us a reference point, and it has started people to see that not only are we feeling that housing is less affordable, but it is actually moving in that direction, and in a way which it never has in Australia before to the same extent. And I think now we're seeing that young people can't afford to simply grow up, get married and buy a house or whatever. They have to have a strategy, and in some cases the strategy involves living a long way away from their parents, or maybe not being able to start their family for a lot longer.
So what might have been some of the causes to have this change? You mentioned that it's becoming more and more prominent now, but why hasn't it been previously? So what are some of the changes today?
We can look at the immediate changes, and the immediate changes have to do with a change in the perception of what real estate is, and so we're starting to see real estate as more of an investment rather than a part of our life that we obtain in order to live. Yep. Right? And for a house, that's really the life of your family. And that change from a place for my family to grow up to a place where I can get rich by having someone else live in my property is a mental change, if you like. It has to do with, I think, more of a broad cultural change towards a more individualistic and more financially oriented approach to society.
So it could be the generation themselves that are growing up now interested in more of that financial gain to try and get ahead in life rather than the family orientation that we might have found our parents having.
I think when we look at cultural change, while we can see it more concentrated in a particular generation, it's probably unfair to say it's all the children's fault. Right? They're greedy and lazy and they stay at home with mum and dad for too long. What's happened is that there are these creeping processes that have happened over generations, really, and also, to a certain extent, they receive wisdom, that they're being sometimes encouraged by their parents to buy an investment property as a preparation for buying a house. Yeah. Whereas, say, a generation or two ago, that idea of an investment property simply wouldn't have happened. You might buy a block of land because you're going to build on it in 5 years' time or whatever, but to buy an investment property is a completely different thing.
Okay. So it's a different mindset that they've got.
Different mindset. Yeah. And this is where the question of cultural change becomes important. We tend to think of our culture as relatively stable, but in fact cultures do go through transitions, and you can see it historically.
So are we talking about the culture of Australia, the culture of yourself or myself? When we talk about the culture shifting, what are you referring to? Well,
if we look at, we're talking about the property market. The curious thing about property market, really curious, is that ownership as we know it right now is relatively new historically.
Okay.
By relatively, I'm talking 500 years.
Right.
And people say, oh, that's a long time ago. But in fact, people have been on the planet for a long time. And to say that it's only since around the 16th century that private ownership in the West has been common, it starts to sort of ring some bells, because suddenly we're seeing something which is almost a historical experiment. And that's pretty much what it is. That when we look at other cultures, for instance the ancient Romans,
Yep.
they moved into a circumstance of having private ownership. Again, in historical terms, relatively short time after, like a century or few, their culture basically decayed through, if you like, cultural selfishness.
Yeah.
And you see, sociologists will talk about two different approaches to society. One is where you approach society as a community where you see yourself obligated to the community, very strong family values, often tribal values, or a sense of belonging to a larger community as defining yourself, as opposed to what the sociologists would see as an association model, where you see society as something that you belong to in order to take something out of it. And so this idea that society is here to help me, to benefit me, to make me rich, very, very different. So it is sort of two very, very different approaches. And I think we've seen that change probably through the 20th century.
Yep.
And now, that's taking root in the way that we are making decisions in real estate that are making the properties less affordable, so more expensive. Historically, it's difficult because usually when a society gets into that situation, one way or another you end up with widespread polarisation of wealth.
Yep.
Another way of looking at that is really like at the end of the Roman Empire. It was effectively a widespread slave state in many ways.
So with the affordability getting out of hand, properties becoming more expensive in today's market, what happens to the people who are looking to buy? Like myself, I guess I would have to look further afield for something more affordable in my budget.
One of the big differences in our period of time now is that you can't afford to live near your parents. It wasn't that long ago. Again, talking in historical terms, let's say go back a century, that if someone was brought up in a town or a part of Sydney or what have you, they could expect to have their children and live next door to mum and dad, and so the kids would grow up with grandparents. Whereas now it's very difficult because in order to have something which is affordable, you might be on the edge of Sydney now, and so for your children to be with their grandparents, it's a long drive, right? And that process, you can actually look at a map of Sydney and see, where the grandparents have lived at different times, or where the nappies are on the clothesline different times. Like we're here, on the fringe of Sydney. When I was in high school, the fringe of Sydney was back around in Baulkham Hills, about half an hour drive down sort of southeast. Now that's going to continue out and won't be so far into the future that people are out the other side of Richmond probably.
Yeah, through the mountains,
that's
into
right.
the country, Lithgow, Bathurst, out that way.
Absolutely, yeah.
So with the property becoming less affordable, so when people and their children are moving away, we talked about it in another program that the property prices are hopefully cresting and will be trending down in the future. So does that mean that we should see a shift of people moving back towards the centre of Sydney, or will these places that they've moved to, will they sustain their own growth in those areas?
I think that's a good point, or one of the curious things that we're seeing. There is a certain return into the centre of the city, but you'll see it's a completely different form of household. The people who are living in Pyrmont tending to have very few children, if any at all, often are not married. And so there's a kind of a sterility about the inhabitants in the centre of our cities now. It's certainly not sort of family friendly. While we're looking at the short-term cycles, so 8 to 10 years, property's going up and down, the long term is tending to move little by little, cycle by cycle, towards being less and less affordable. And that is now being accepted by a lot of economists as an inevitable trend. And so it's assumed that in times to come, relatively few people in the community will be able to afford their own house. And so what you were saying about wanting to own your own house, your children may not even be able to have that as an objective if they want to live in Sydney. The alternative is to find employment sort of away from Sydney.
So if we do want to stay in Sydney, you see a lot of young people turning to the rental market. And now some of these rents, when you hear about them, they're quite ridiculous when you hear about them. You know, you're talking about $500 to $700 a week in rent for a couple's income. I mean, again, it's a large proportion of that. Is that the trend that we seem to find, that with property prices going up, rental prices also go up accordingly?
Rental prices and house prices, capital prices I'd call them, do follow each other fairly closely. So there's a ratio that tends to be fairly stable, called the yield. And so, yes, no, rents do go up. And the fact that you've been priced out of the buyer's market doesn't mean that you're going to get cheap accommodation. It just means that, it's a little bit more affordable. But you're still going to have those difficulties. You're probably going to be pushed into higher density and so on. I mean, a lot of this comes down to how we value family. That if we had a strong value on family and said, look, the only residences that are going to work, if you like, are going to be some place where I can bring up half a dozen children and have a backyard where they can run around. Yep. That would then define the size of our blocks, whether or not we had a backyard, many other things about the way that we live.
So that would just influence us as an individual. If those were the things that we were after, we would then look for a place accordingly.
That's right.
And in this market, it seems that you do have to go a bit further out. Again, we discussed it earlier that the density in some of these developments coming up seem to be the houses packed so close together that you barely get a backyard in this house. So you've got to move further away.
When you look at it, a lot of children now spend far more time, playing with their phones. And so you don't need a backyard when your exercise only gets as far as your thumb muscles.
Yeah, that's a bit unfortunate.
And also the size of families. And again, this is something which comes down to culture. Yeah. That we're now moving into an era where a family of 2 is considered to be large. A family of 4 is extraordinary. I find it curious. I sort of speak especially to older people, and they're sort of talking about the difficulties of having families. And so, well, did you have any brothers and sisters? Oh yes, I came from a family of 6 or 8 or 12. Yeah. In the days when 10 or a dozen children was very common. Whereas now we're moving away from that because as a society we've chosen property investment over children. Our real estate is starting to reflect that.
The culture changes, the families become smaller. You mentioned that you see that trend that towards the centre of the city in Pyrmont, in those areas, you see a certain sterility.
Yes.
Where people aren't having kids because they choose to live the lifestyle that they wish in the centre of the CBD, in the heart of it all. Now, is that a trend that you see common in other places?
In other cities?
Yeah.
Certainly in western cities, it's becoming common, especially in the centre of Sydney, centre of cities. In Sydney, there's a handful of inner suburbs where the occupancy rate, and this is where the the Australian Bureau of Statistics, actually measures occupied houses. So you have to have at least one person to have an occupied house, right? The occupancy levels in a handful of the inner suburbs is less than 2, about 1.8. Wow. Now when you think about that, you're talking about occupied dwellings, and if you go home at night and there's someone to talk to, you're in an above average household. Now that's sterile. It's not something that's able to survive over time, but that's what's occupying our cities more and more.
So what will happen over time for these little pockets of sterility there?
More people will probably come in from the fringes,
yep.
Where you can afford to have families, and also you'll find people that have values that value families will be having their families, but their children, whether they follow the values and the culture of their parents or not. And this is one of the things we often see with people coming to Australia. Yep. They might come from a society which has a strong culture and a strong respect for family. Their children grow up and they can say, well, I want the new iPhone. I'm not going to have kids. And so they become enculturated and to a certain extent leave those values.
Yeah. And that just defines where they end up deciding to live in the long run.
That's right. And that often affects things like their religious values and so on.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier that the the concept of property ownership is relatively young. When we're talking young, you mentioned 500 years.
Yes.
So what was happening prior to that?
Before that, depending on where you look around the world, generally people did not own their own properties. So we're complaining about the falling home ownership levels, but we actually find that when it's done properly, when land is understood to be a community resource, where the benefits from land, the rental value for land, is actually used for the good of the community, then the community actually flourishes, and nobody really minds not owning their own house. The difficulty we have today is that when we rent from somebody who is renting purely for profit, and they won't let you, put a nail in the wall or have a dog or all of these sort of things. The system that was happening in Europe before then now gets a lot of bad press. It's called Feudal System.
Okay.
And basically land was all owned by the community leaders, the lords, the nobles. You find the feudal system exists or has existed at different times all over the world, different places, even in places like Tonga in the South Pacific, South America, Northern Africa, say in Egypt and so on, all across Asia, and of course Europe. And when it's understood as land being a resource which is given to us and ultimately free by God, and the benefit from it, the rental value from it, is something that should be used basically for alms, if you like, for supporting the community. For in Europe, the rent that say someone owning a house would be paying to their lord, that would be paying for their defence, their education, their legal system, their bridges, their churches. And so in a sense it wasn't simply going to a private person's pocket. And this is one of the big differences, that when you have a feudal system that's operating in that social sense, a sense of community where the leaders understood their obligations, you end up with a very efficient economy, oddly enough.
Okay. And is that something that we still find in some parts of the world today?
It's largely disappearing. One, I think, important example, and it still exists, is the way that in the Middle East, most of the oil production, and we hear about all of that, most of the oil production is done by government-owned enterprises. Not because they're socialists, in fact they're just the opposite, but it's because they believe that mines, like a number of other areas of property, is something that belongs to the community. And so the government, as a representative, if you like, of the community, runs the oil company, and that will help that country sort of flourish. And so, in a certain extent, it's an example of that kind of social use of property for the community good. And you see it, like Iran, I think, is still a very, very good example of that. Some Western powers aren't very fond of it because it interferes with private corporate, profits. And also the respect that some countries have for their own people owning their land. So in Australia, if foreign investor comes to Australia, we welcome them and sell them our farms and our mines and whatever else, our city buildings. In many other countries, and again I'll just mention Iran, I think it's still the case, it certainly was the case until the last time I looked, a foreigner could not own Iranian land. Well, what that means is that the value of the land, one way or another, stays in the country, which is far more healthy for the long term.
Okay. And then in places like Australia, over historically here, have we noticed that the concept of ownership different between, say, the Indigenous Australians compared to the Westerners?
Interesting you mentioned that. Indigenous people, by and large, whether in Australia or elsewhere, have a very strong sense that the land is something that is given to them by, like for Australian Aboriginal, their creator spirits, with the obligation to pass it on to their children.
Yeah.
Now, the idea of taking a capital gain, by capital gain I mean I buy something for, let's say, $100,000 and I sell it for $1 million. It's gained in its capital value, so it's the capital gain. It's a profit I've made just from sitting it. For an Aboriginal person, that would be an absolutely horrendous, a hideous idea, abomination. Whereas for an Australian, I think, well, that's just what I did. I bought my property. I did buy my first property for about $30,000. I'm likely to sell the house I'm living in for over $1 million. I haven't done anything to it, really. Now, I'll be selling that to your children. Yeah. They're going to be a lot worse off. Now, if it was an Aboriginal community, I would probably be giving it from my forebears or your forebears, and I'd be giving it to our children or our grandchildren pretty much intact. Well, I wouldn't take a profit out of it. So it's a completely different cultural approach.
Compared to what we have today?
Compared to what we have in the Western approach to property. And really that Western, especially out of the English-speaking West, is very much towards private ownership, individual profit-taking at the expense of everybody else. The theory there is that if I sort of, earn a profit as hard as I can for myself, and you earn a profit as hard as you can, we'll both end up wealthy. That's the theory of it. In practice, what happens is that there might be one person like me and 10 people like you, and I'll end up getting rich and you'll end up getting poor. When we talk about Australia's settlement, Australia was settled because the jails in England weren't big enough. And they weren't big enough because people were stealing a loaf of bread from here or an apple from there to feed their family. Now, that was in the world's most affluent, or its richest country. England at that stage was the economic giant, and yet its people were starving. And so they were being put into prison and sent up to New South Wales. From here, I think Australia has ended up with a very strong sense of wanting that independence of owning your own house, kind of with that sort of cultural memory of wanting to not have that victimisation that was happening in, let's say, the 18th century especially.
You mentioned something to me a little bit earlier about the concept of interest on loans and its effect on affordability. I'd like you to elaborate on that a little bit, if you could, please. Yes,
you find that there are three interrelated principles in economics that ultimately are moral. And because they're moral, they tend to be pursued more vigorously by religious communities, or the people that have a dynamic behind them of wanting to serve God, and those that don't. The three principles is the immorality of charging interest on a money loan. In Europe, that's referred to as usury. It's basically what a bank does with part of the interest that they charge from the loan. It's basically a risk-free profit that you make. I lend you money that I don't need, and you pay me more money back. It's a bit complicated. We could do a whole session on that. Yeah. In the East, it's referred to as riba, and in both cultures, it was considered as a serious sin. There's the correct use of land. Again, great religions, Islam, Christianity, understood land as something that was created by God, given to humanity for free, with an obligation to use it, if you're blessed with it, for the good of the community. So to give alms or to support, say, building the mosque or whatever. That's the second one. The third principle is the way we buy and sell. So if I can maybe sell you, those very lovely looking objects for, let's say, $10, or maybe they're worth $100, I don't know. But if I can make a fair business and support my family by selling, let's say, for $10, that might be the fair price for it. If I know that you really need it and you're willing to pay $1,000 for it, well, what's happening to that difference between the 100 and the 1,000, or the 10 and the 1,000? Right? Is this profit? Yeah, it's just this. It's great profit. I'm becoming fabulously wealthy as a businessman. Really, what I'm doing is stealing from you, because I can. You might be able to buy those from somewhere else for $10, but for whatever reason you've got a particular need. You may not be aware of what their price is. That gap is considered to be something that if I do systematically, by going out and finding people who are willing to spend $1,000, I'm really stealing. I'm selling you $10 worth of of work of art, and I'm stealing that 990. So there's three principles.
Yep.
Now, all of those three have an effect on the way that the land market operates. That if the banks that are charging riba, usury, are willing to lend us more money, and we then put it into real estate investment because we want to earn money as an investment rather than to own it as an occupier, then you've got these sort of two questionable moral practices kind of interacting with each other and driving the property markets up. In years gone by, when I first started doing economics, banks would lend around half of the value of a house.
Wow.
Right? And now we'd say, oh, wouldn't that be dreadful? We couldn't afford it. Right? But in fact, what it did, it kept the value down. If you were able to, let's say, save $1,000 or $10,000, let's say $100,000 in today's money, the bank would lend you another 100. Now, if that's all that the average Australian was able to bid when they went to an auction, what would the price of a house be?
200,000.
Yeah. Whereas we go down the street and we're looking at, what, $7, $8, $9 million? Right? And what are the banks lending? They're lending up to 95%.
Wow.
Right? So I go in with my 100,000. The bank is now very comfortable to lend me 900,000, assuming I've got a job that will pay and I promise not to have children and all that sort of stuff. Right? So these two interactions, the finance industry and this perception of property as something to use almost as a weapon, right? Because I'm no longer using it socially to help the community, I'm using it to exploit the community.
In turn, driving up the prices,
That's
making
right.
things less affordable for people in the long run.
Yeah, and there's a rich tradition, if you like, in both Christianity and Islam, looking at those issues.
And so, over time, in the long run, have you been seeing this throughout history, the property prices just slowly tracking upwards? You don't see a relieving significantly in any...
The unfortunate thing that you see in history is they do tend to track upwards until the society fails. Sometimes you'll hand major economic corrections. The Great Depression people still talk about. The global financial crisis, which happened roughly 10 years ago, really wasn't nearly as major as the Great Depression, certainly in Australia. We've had these major financial crises about every 50 years or so, back to the beginning of the modern era. So I mentioned that real estate only started being done the way that it is in the West now about 500 years ago. Okay. Right? That's about when these property cycles, these 50-year cycles, started to be observed. And so there, if you like, a little bit of a relief valve. They're still not helping because at the end of even the Great Depression, the wealthy people at the beginning of the Great Depression were relatively more wealthy at the end of it. That's not the story we normally hear, but when you look at the facts, it's the ordinary people in the community that end up worth it off.
Okay. And so, if there was anything that you could do for the community, or you think the community should be doing to help alleviate some of this affordability issues, as a final point to wrap up, what would you suggest or recommend, or what do you see?
Some of the most interesting things is when you see communities actually making decisions within themselves to treat property in a slightly different way. And for instance, intergenerational lending. Grandparents, rather than having their own superannuation investments or something, actually give their money, their spare money, to their grandchildren who are maybe just starting off in life. I've seen that in a number of communities, say the Vietnamese, a number of other communities, where you've got a strong sense of community culture. Often you'll find those systems working. I knew a Lebanese property developer. He made a lot of money developing for the world, but amongst his own community, he was actually promoting a thing called it was called the 3G strategy, and he had a very elaborate system, 3Gs for 3 generations. And he was basically encouraging other people in his community how to be able to have people's develop real estate in a way which helped keep residences affordable and livable. In some cases, you can produce almost like a micro feudal system, where you make long-term leases available for your own community members.
Yep.
Now that's a topic in itself, so I won't try and start to explain that here.
We can leave that for another day.
That's right.
But it's no, thank you very much for joining us in today's program. I really appreciate your time. Thanks very much, Gary.
Most welcome.
As we've discussed today, the issue of affordability is a vast topic in itself. Family cultures, values and society all play a part in the rising prices. Also, the change in perception from purchasing for occupation, for purchasing for investment has also played a part in all this. Thanks very much for watching. We look forward to bringing you another program from MTA International Australia Studios. Jazakumullah and Khudafis.